Welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Identity is Security. I'm Shay Mann and I will be your moderator. Today's webinar is in listen-only mode. If you have any questions throughout the event, go ahead and submit those in the Q&A panel and we will answer them during the Q&A session at the end of the presentation. This session will be recorded and we will email you a link to the recorded version tomorrow. Joining us today is SailPoint's Chief Marketing Officer, Juliet Riscala. Juliet, I will pass it over to you to get us started.
Thank you, Shay, and good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us this morning. Before we start, I'd like to explain the bold title of this webinar, which is Identity Security. In the last Piper Jaffray annual survey of CIOs on their IT spending priority for the year 2018, security came as #1 priority for those CIOs. And that is no surprise to any of us. But within this category, they rank things like endpoint security, cloud security, network security, and a rising subcategory of the security category is identity management. So within the security category, identity management came second in priority, right behind endpoint security. And what was interesting is like last year, it was actually the third rank. And we've seen identity rising in terms of priority in the mind of CIOs in the last couple of years. So that's what prompted this title, Identity is Security. And we'll try in this webinar to explain the reason why, if you're looking at your security infrastructure today, identity governance should have a big part of it. So we just started 2018, right? And we all hope for a new year during which all challenges will be overcome. Unfortunately, the world has not changed much, and data breaches are a constant threat to organizations, and they continue to have to prepare against them. Just looking back at 2017, and even though the full numbers have not come in quite yet regarding data breaches, we know that this is going to be another record numbers. In fact, 1.9 billion records were exposed in the first half of last year alone, with many notable breaches in the second half that were not included in these statistics. And since the Yahoo data breaches, the Equifax last year, and even the RS breach a couple years ago, many of us believe or should expect that our personal data is for sale on the darknet waiting to be exploited by a buyer. This is our reality. Now, the reality that organizations are facing is that they're failing to protect consumer personal data almost every day. And now new regulations like GDPR are kicking in to help us say, stop, enough is enough. We got to do something. And the problem partially lies in enterprise protection measures where the perimeter they used to use to protect their sensitive data is gone. In simple words, hackers have a new preferred attack vector, and it's not the network anymore, it's us. Because people are much easier to crack than a 512-bit hash. At any large organization, the number of entry points for a hacker or the exposure points are as large as the number of users they let into their system. That is the reality. And for the hackers, the methods to gain the access of the users are multiple. First, there's social engineering. Who is not on Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, WhatsApp, or any other application that allow us to easily communicate with each other, but on which it is also very easy to spill the wrong information or be tricked into giving away something that we shouldn't. And even if you're very careful, like I am, being in security, the nature of the social media is to expose the relationship. Who do you work for? Who do you know? Who's your assistant? And those relationships are going to be exploited through social engineering by criminals. And then there's phishing. Email has become a primary form of communication for nearly all of us. The first thing we do when we wake up is to check our email. It's also the last thing we do before going to bed. But we're so inundated with messages that fake and malicious emails can be tough to spot in the craziness of our everyday. And the hackers are getting really good at making their phishing attempts look real. And then there is employee negligence or even insider breach. In a dark reading article yesterday, I saw a survey from Networks Cloud Security that stated that 45% of organizations think their biggest security risk are employees. Despite training, despite security awareness, and even though we see less infamous headlines on laptop left where they shouldn't or posted under a keyboard containing password, we still see quite a few of employee negligence. We're seeing things like sharing credentials among employees to a corporate application. That is a common and pretty dangerous practice today in organizations. And of course, there are insider fraud. Here's a specific example of the latter. Just last year, a network of a hospital in Kentucky was impacted by an insider. According to Healthcare Info Security, a former employee had, on 2 past occasions during his employment, obtained a certain billing information by creating the appearance that he needed the information to carry out his job duties. It affected over 600,000 individuals. The data was encrypted, so from a security perspective, MedSanta Health thought that they were covered, but because there were reason to believe that that particular employee could decrypt the CD containing sensitive data, this incident was considered and reported as a breach. So it only takes one employee, one user, or one of us to be compromised to cause problems for a whole organization. We are all a point of exposure, no matter how careful we are. And more often than not, when it relates to a data breach, it is people that end up causing or being responsible for the loss of sensitive data. Historically, we've taken a lot of measures to secure information. First, there's network security. In an era of data centers, firewalls and security gateway were the primary line of finance, and they still are. I worked enough years in network security to tell you that there is no way network security will go away. They're still very, very critical for our data centers. But in a new era of fragmented information, of cloud computing and social media, where sensitive data is not anymore secured inside the perimeter, in that server, inside your data center, network security has become insufficient and a secondary priority for IT security staff. The proof is that survey that I referenced earlier regarding the CIO IT spending for 2018 showed that firewalls dropped to a 5th rank in priority within the security top priority category. Then there's endpoint security. Devices like smartphones, laptops, and tablets are our main computing tool today, and none of us can perform our work without them. But now they hold all our data, including all our sensitive data. So we have to secure them, period. Data security. Our data shifted to being in data centers, to the cloud, and security needs to evolve to match the changing landscape. We're creating so much data, some of it very sensitive, and saving it wherever we can. Structured systems like SAP are not the only places financial data lives today. Take the example of a public company preparing its earnings. The financials are going to prepare within SAP, but then as the preparation goes on, those financials are going to be exported and put into a Word document or maybe an Excel spreadsheet or a PowerPoint presentation. Those files are going to be emailed internally to maybe a specific set of people, but the security that that sensitive data was relying on inside the SAP system is not there anymore. And now we need to start considering securing it. And finally, there is identity. And if you're attending this webinar, you know that identity management is now at the center of security today. and that it is a much larger and complex problem than just giving access to employees to corporate apps and systems and data. It is about managing and controlling the digital identities that get access to the sensitive data, whether it resides in systems, in cloud apps, or in files, folders, and emails. So identity is more than managing access. It is about answering three main questions. Who currently has access to what? How is that access being used? And who actually should have access? In a world of digital transformation that all enterprises are living in, those corporations have more systems, applications, and data than ever before, and many of them are interconnected. Enterprises also not only have employees accessing those resources, but also contractors, suppliers, partners, and even customers that may require to access those corporate data to collaborate or perform their job. And what is tying each application, system, files, and data to these users, what is tying together each part of the security infrastructure in which we belong are the digital identities. And identity governance is what? Manage, control, govern, if you wish, but also secure those digital identities. So let me give you an example of identity governance. It's just more than access and help manage the security and the risk around the data. Let's take the example of a sales rep in a traditional company. In order to do his job, the rep will need to have access to Salesforce. He will also have access to the company commission tool so he can view his commission. And just like any other employee, he will get access to the HR system of the company. But his access to Salesforce should be restricted solely to his territory, not the whole global view of the company. In this case, it's the West U.S. part of the United States. In the same fashion, he should be able to view his commission, but should not be able to calculate it nor approve it to respect the clear separation of duty required by Sarbanes-Oxley. Finally, he should be able to see his pay and benefit in the company HR system, but he should not be able to process his commission to payroll. Identity governance is more than just granting access. It's making sure that each person has access to only what they need to do their jobs without causing risk to the organization. This is the principle of the least privilege. They will not be able to breach compliance requirement of separation of duties if an identity governance solution is managing those entitlements. So identity governance gives context to all that an employee, a partner, a supplier, a contractor, or any users does within the entire enterprise infrastructure and the data it holds. Whether it is on cloud, regarding cloud or on-premise apps, whether it's looking at device both on and off network, and whether it's looking at structured data in systems like SAP or unstructured data in files and folders. Put simply, identity is what ties everything together. And today, it lies at the center of enterprise IT security. Identity is also governing the nuances of what each person can and should be doing with their access, just like this example with that sales rep shows. It mitigates entitlement creep that eventually happens over time when an employee grows in the organization. It helps identifying orphan accounts and removing them. Those orphan accounts can be created after the termination of some employees or sometimes just by active employee not even using an application anymore. And of course it helps with complying to separation of duty policies. Identity governance is what secures but also empowers an organization. This is why I believe it is fair to say that identity is security today in 2018. So let's look at some stats that were published in several reports last year. Let me know if this sounds familiar. 37% of organizations are plagued by poor password agent. Remember when I talked about credential sharing? It's happening in more than 1 in 3 organizations. Half organizations struggle with visibility into contracts workers' access to company resource. That means that 1 in 2 contractor could be accessing something that is not supposed to do or to see, and we do not know about it. And then over 70% of organizations unsure how to manage and protect all that data that lies outside structured system. Gartner estimates that 80% of all corporate data is unstructured and lies in files and folders. That is a lot of data that needs to be controlled and secured. And organizations are just starting to look at this unstructured issue. Statistic aside, every organization needs to be able to do certain things in regard to their security. So here's a quick acid test for you. If you can do the following things that I'm going to mention, you may need some identity governance help. So if you can see who has access to each and every application, system, and data store in your organization, if you can't know what your users are doing with their access to your organization resources, if you can't automatically modify or terminate access based on a user's changing role, especially when they leave the organization, and finally, if you can't flag suspicious activity and alert the appropriate administrators to terminate access or mitigate risk, then your current security has identity shape holes in it. With the right identity governance solution in place, you should be able to see everything, govern everything, and empower everyone in your organization. And only once you've done that, you can begin to build what we call an identity-aware infrastructure. But what I want to emphasize here is the empowering of everyone. Though it seems like a security solution, it is also about providing access to users to everything they need to do their work. But it is everything they need to do their work, not everything that lies in the company. And that's where the governance kick in. That's where the governance help with mitigating risk around that sensitive data that we are working so hard to protect. Looking back at all those identities and resources we talked about earlier, it is possible to provide them with knowledge of each other. It is possible to track and analyze who has access to what in the organization, and then to compare it to your desired state of who should have access to what. At any time, the status of who has access to what will change. Your desired state of who should have access to what is what the truth is, and those need to be compared and mapped all the time. It is also possible to have visibility into what each user is doing with that access. And with automation into processes like the joiner, mover, leaver process, which is really managing onboarding of new employees, transfers of current employees, or termination of employees, by automating that process, it would be easy to ensure that when people change roles or left the company, the access they had was appropriate for that role, or should just be revoked if they are no longer working in the corporation. When each part of your organization has identity context, it creates an identity-aware infrastructure, and it enables an identity-aware workforce. So today you have the opportunity to check if your organization passed the identity test. You can ask yourself, do you have full visibility over and into each identity and system in your organization? Further, can you attest to knowing who is accessing your organization's sensitive data wherever it is stored? What about what they're doing with that data? Are you prepared for the requirement and the potential consequence of non-compliance of GDPR? And finally, do your employee get only the right access for the right resource at the right time? And are those controls automated to help you do that in a very systematic way? So yes, identity is security today in 2018. But it's also much more than that. It also helps with IT efficiency. I talked about automation, and it helps with compliance. So to just demonstrate those 2 points, I'm going to take a couple of real-world examples of just how our identity governance has empowered a few of our customers. This company is a Fortune 500 manufacturer, and they decided to move away from an old legacy identity solution that they had. They needed to update their process to streamline their efforts and improve the experience for their business users. So with an identity governance solution from SailPoint, they were able to automate provisioning, and over the course of a year, they handled 62,000 user requests automatically. When we asked them to put a price on this, or dollar amount, they mentioned that they saved them $1 million in help desk expenses alone. This was all about IT efficiency in their eyes. Here's an example of how we've helped the customer with compliance. This global company has over 300,000 employees and was struggling to comply with SOX, PCI, SAS 70, and other regulations. It's not difficult to imagine that manually emailing spreadsheets to attempt to certify who should have access to what in such a large company was clearly a problem. Once they implemented our identity governance solution, they were able to aggregate identity data for more than 400 digital identities and 10 million entitlements. Their separation of duty policies are now accurately controlled, and they have quarterly access certification in place. When it comes time to show compliance and to produce compliance report and to prove their compliance in the case of GDPR, they clearly will be much ready than the average corporation. When all the pieces of an identity-aware infrastructure comes together to help organizations achieve all that they could, security, efficiency, productivity, compliance, and much more, they are empowered, and identity is the key that unlocks organizations' potential. They also become more prepared for upcoming regulation like GDPR, and I'd like to spend some time on it just because we are in the year of GDPR, and it has been so confusing. But GDPR is a new category of legislation, and it's clear, not just because of the steepness of its penalties, but because, as stated in Article 5 of its text, it requires accountability. In simple words, organizations must be able to prove their compliance with the directive around the handling, storage, and usage of personal data, whereas previously the Data Protection Directive, or DPD, in the EU required responsibility for compliance. Accountability versus responsibility. This is a big, big legal difference. Now they must prove their compliance, and that is something that SailPoint Identity Governance can help with. Let me get a little bit more in the details of how we can help that, so it's not just a blank statement. So if you have an identity governance solution in place that spans across structured and unstructured data, you can comply with all 4 articles of GDPR that pertain to identity governance. First is in the personal data discovery, right? Before you protect that personal data or you secure it, you need to discover where it is in the organization, and you need to be able to classify that personal data. At the same time, in order to start being able to manage that personal data you just discovered, you need to assign owners. When it comes to unstructured data, think files, Excel spreadsheet, PowerPoint, it's very hard to know who owns it versus data in an SAP environment where the owner is clear. So our solution helps through crowdsourcing to elect the most probable owner and then give ownership of the data to that owner for them to manage and perform regular access review. So when you've done that, when you have discovered, classify, and assign an owner to the data, then you need to secure that personal data. You need to get full visibility over what sensitive data you have, as well as who can and is accessing it. And then you can extend your control over the data with automatic access modification or revocation, depending on the change that is detected, all that with the owner assigned. Beyond the initial security setup that you do around those personal data, you must also have monitoring and detection, such as fine-grained audit trails that helps with forensic after a breach does occur and help demonstrate compliance as per Article 5. As part of the rest of the automation, our identity governance solution provides alerts to the data owners and any violations specified in your policy. You can also set up role-based access control to ensure that any access that is granted is the minimum needed for that user role. And finally, your identity governance solution should be logging and reporting on everything to not only create the identity context that enables an identity-aware infrastructure, but also give you a paper trail to prove compliance. So in those 4 points, it's a quick review on how self-point ID governance can get you to a step closer to GDPR compliance as the deadline is fast approaching. So the question you may ask yourself is, where are you today? How do you know if your security or identity program is up to par? Well, we thought you may ask, and we developed last year an identity survey, which is really a risk assessment around identity issues that takes about 15 to 20 minutes to complete. You know, it takes some time, but the questions are very specific, and it helps us give you results of your survey and giving you insight in what your strengths and your weakness lie in your identity program. After taking the survey, we issue a score that compares you to your peers, but also a report that gives you detailed recommendations specific to your results and help you figure out your next step to a more secure organization. So thank you for listening today, and Shay, now we will take a few questions.
Great, thank you, Juliet. We'll go ahead and jump in. Our first question. So what's the difference between identity and access management?
That's actually a question that has been asked several times over the past few months. The category, as you can see, is usually mentioned as identity and access management, or IAM. It's a blanket term that is used by the industry to basically describe the security provided by identity governance as well as access management. So access management is about things like single sign-on, giving access, granting access of an user to an application, right? Identity governance goes beyond that. It basically defines, what that user should be able to do within that specific application, right? So I refer back to the example of that sales rep where he can have access to all Salesforce, and that would be just access management. But identity governance will say, no, that sales rep is really working on that territory, and that's all he should see. He should not see all the other opportunities, all the forecasts for the company. He doesn't need to know that to do his job. So companies are are attempting to be more compliant to different things. That type of fine-grained entitlement becomes really important, and that is what identity governance is versus just access management, which is granting access to an application.
Great, thank you. Okay, our next question. My main concern at my organization is BYOD. How does identity help with that? Isn't that part of endpoint security?
Endpoint security definitely helps with the BYOD problem. So if you have an endpoint, that device is going to hold information. It's storing information, probably from your email with attachment now. Those smartphones are able to display. So the endpoint security is going to make sure everything is encrypted on that device and that the device is locked properly and so forth. But identity governance does also enable you to have very fine policies about how do you want people in your organization to manage or to use or access sensitive data when they are on a mobile device versus, a desktop in the company or some. So you can write very fine-grained policies saying, well, you can access Salesforce, Juliet, because your CMO has cell phone, but when you're on your mobile device, you will have to maybe use a different security module, or you may not be able to look at the forecast. You may only be able to look at specific opportunities. So you can start really defining security policies for the access on those devices particularly, and that is different than pure endpoint security.
Does your solution work within a cloud infrastructure?
Yes, we have a solution, Identity IQ, that is on-premise, but many of our customers decide to put them in the private cloud or in the public cloud. We also have a solution that is pure SaaS, in which case it's a service that we provide, and we obviously handling all the cloud infrastructure that goes with the solution. So we believe in developing, very strong identity governance, but we also believe in providing customers with all the options of delivery and deployment that they wish. So our products can be on-premise in your data center. They can be put in your data centers, but on the private cloud using, cloud infrastructure such as Azure and AWS. It can be, or you can select a SaaS, a pure SaaS option with Identity Now.
The security infrastructure at my organization has been there for years. How can identity governance infiltrate that without doing everything all over again?
That's a good question. I mean, obviously, we don't recommend to, each time you want to add a solution to have to rip and replace everything. And I think that's something that at some point we recognized quite early on. When we build our identity platform, we build it as open as possible. And in the heart of an identity solution, you need to connect to pretty much all the infrastructure in the organization. It's obviously the data sources like an SAP or a data folder or you name it, but it's also to other IT operations or IT security infrastructure, such as, your help desk or your service management solution, just like your SIEM for event logging and so forth. So, we have had, I think, quite a bit of webinars and document on our open identity platform and what it means, but it's really answer that particular question is how do you plug in identity governance if you're just starting there when you already have all your infrastructure. We have many connectors, including connectors to very specific vertical application, and we also partner with over 300 technology partners in order to integrate with them. Some integration are very detailed in the data schema, just like privileged access management, SSO, access management, SIEM, and so forth. Some others will just be APIs and SDK, but we do offer the most, honestly, the only and first open identity platform to help you go through that transition very easily.
Great, thank you. Okay, that is all the time that we have for questions. Everyone, keep an eye out for an email from us tomorrow that will include a recording of today's presentation. You can share that with interested colleagues that weren't able to attend or watch it on demand on your own time. We'll also include a link to the identity score survey that Juliet mentioned to be able to see where you stand with your current identity efforts. Not only will you receive your identity score, but we will send you a personalized report with recommendations, best practices, and tips to strengthen your identity program. Thanks everyone who joined us today. Juliet, thank you for your time, and we hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, everyone.